Well, the older I get, the quicker the years seem to zip by, that's for sure. And it seems like only yesterday, which was a year ago, that I sat here and said, where do you want to be in your spiritual growth in 1 year's time? If you look back 1 year ago, where did you want to be then? Have you made progress in your expansion of your soul, in the unfoldment of your consciousness? So I ask that same question again, and there's no judgment. There's no, if we haven't grown as much as we had intended, that's okay. Just set a new intention. Set a new intention. One of the things that I want to mention is that, excuse me, the Bible is full of symbolism, and we in our culture, we don't necessarily understand that symbolism. They're pertinent to a different culture, a different time, a different place. And one of the symbols that is used are the numbers. And the number 4 and 40, excuse me, is used a lot. And the number 4 represented completion. At least this is the way it was explained to me. Completion physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And the number 0 represented an indefinite amount of time, as long as it takes, as long as it takes. So if Moses goes to the desert for 40 years to complete the growth that he needed to complete in order to begin his mission of freeing the Israelites from Egypt, the symbolism there is he went into the desert. The desert typically signifies a prayer life, being separated and isolated from the ways of the world while we engage in our spiritual practice. So he went to the desert for as long as it took to grow physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And he had to complete all 4. And if he hadn't completed all 4, he could not have moved forward. And you can see this. The reason that he went to the desert was that he lost his temper and he killed the Egyptian officer. Now this is a teaching story, symbolism. Emotionally, he wasn't mature. So he had to go to the desert until he got it all together, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Now the reason that I mention that here is that sometimes as we embark on a new year and we start to set out resolutions or goals for the year, and we look back on these goals and resolutions that we set the previous year, we fall short. We haven't accomplished everything. And part of the reason for that is mentally we can set the goal, but we have to grow into that physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And it's particularly true when we are setting kind of spiritual goals for ourselves, if there is even such a thing. But how do I want to grow? How will I know that I'm growing? How will I know that I'm coming into a deeper experience of the magnificence of the divine? So I just put that out there for you as a way of giving yourself some leeway. If you haven't grown as much as you wanted to in the last year, that's okay. This is a new year. We begin again. We wipe the slate clean, so to speak. We scrape the building clear to the foundation, as the scripture tells us. We don't try to put new wine into old skins. We get new skins and we begin again. But as you grow this year, please keep in mind those 4 aspects. It's not enough just to grow in book knowledge mentally. It's not enough just to read and to listen. It's good, it's necessary, but there's more. There's more to it. Physically, we have to be able to live it. Emotionally, we have to be able to feel it. Spiritually, we have to be able to be it. So I asked the same question this year that I asked last year, and the year before, and the year before. When we get together in 1 year's time, and we sit here to celebrate the beginning, the first Sunday of the new year, where do you want to be on your path? How do you want to change? How do you want to grow? So I leave you with that, and kind of for the next 4 to 5 weeks in January, we go back to the basics. We call it going back to the basics. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. We finished out the last year. In Christmas, we talk about the birth of the Christ. Our coming into awareness that the presence of the divine is with us. Right? Emmanuel meant God is with us. God is with us. But unless we realize that, unless we actually experience that, it may well not as be with us. Remember, it's done unto you according to your belief. If you don't believe it, it might as well not be. Sounds like double talk, sounds like double speak. It works for us by not working. But we have to unfold. See, we have to unfold our consciousness. We have to grow into something. And until we are ready to step into it, until we are ready to grow into it, it's as if it's hidden from us, obscured from our vision. As I said in the opening treatment, in the Gospel of Thomas, the author has Thomas saying to Jesus, and you have to remember now, the message of Jesus was about the kingdom. Seek ye first the kingdom, which was the presence of the divine. Go within. Go within to your secret place. Go within to your prayer closet. Seek ye first the kingdom, and everything else will be added unto you. So if we just take a step back and try to take all of what we get from the New Testament and boil it down to a few sentences, we might be able to say the message of Jesus was about the kingdom. He was constantly telling people about the kingdom. So Thomas says to him, well, where is this kingdom? What, is it a physical place? Is it have a castle and walls and all these things? See? And Jesus said, it's already here. See? It's already here. It's all around us. But people do not see it. People do not see it. And remember last week and the week before, I mentioned several times that throughout the teachings of Jesus, he said, let he who has eyes see. Let he who has ears hear. And that was an idiom in that language, in the Aramaic language. It meant you got to pay attention because this isn't coming in the ordinary way. Of course, the ones who have eyes can see and the ones who have ears can hear. But this message is coming through a different way. You have to receive it a different way. So people look upon the earth and they do not see the kingdom. They have to prepare. They have to prepare through their practice. Make themselves available to it. They have to experience it. So we finish off the year by asking, how this year have we realized that presence of the divine within us more fully than perhaps a year ago? And then we start where we are now, the beginning of the new year, with setting our intention for growth. As I suggest, the intention to actually experience the presence of the divine more fully in our lives, not just intellectually know about it, not just feel it kind of emotionally in terms of when we get caught up in a beautiful poem or a song or things like that, but to actually experience it, And then how are we going to begin again? How are we going to start all over with a Zen mind or a beginner's mind? Now, one thing I will add to what I just said there is something I read in Joel Goldsmith, who's one of my favorite modern mystics. And Goldsmith said, we have to ask ourselves if all these religions and these theologies and these philosophies that we study, they say that God is omnipresence, God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, God is all-presence. Then we have to ask ourselves, why does evil exist? Why do bad things happen? Right? And Rabbi Kushner, wrote the book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, which I believe, was his interpretation of the book of Job. And the book of Job, some scholars think, was the very first book of the Bible, because it deals with what the theologians call the problem of evil. If God is so good, why do we have wars? Why do we have famines? Why do people get sick? Why do we have all of these calamities? And Goldsmith said it's not enough just to say that God is everywhere present or God is all presence. That presence must be realized. It must be experienced. And where it is not realized, it might as well not be. It is kind of laying dormant, if you want to think of it that way. It is laying dormant, waiting to be discovered. So our growth then, our spiritual growth as we go through this life, is to discover and to experience and to realize the presence a little bit more fully every day. Okay? I have Robert Lamont from Godspell, Day by Day, to know thee more clearly, to follow thee more nearly, to love thee more dearly, day by day, day by day. So I invite you to consider as we launch into this year, is that what you would like to experience? That's what I'm suggesting, but each of us must make our own choice. We must make our own decision. Is this something that we really want to do? And of course, then if so, then what are we willing to do? What kind of effort are we willing to put into it? What kind of dedication are we willing to put into it? From the East, we get the parable, don't seek God unless you're seeking as earnestly as you would seek a pond if your hair was on fire. Is this the year that we find that passion, that fire, the priority? So I just toss those out for consideration. So one thing that I suggest, I read this in one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books this week. Get yourself a pad of sticky notes, and on each sticky note, write down, "Are you sure?" with a question mark. Are you sure? And just put those sticky notes in different places where you're going to find them. Are you sure? Are you sure? And when you see them, be reminded that when you have an opinion about something, when you say that this is the way something is, ask yourself, are you sure? Are you sure? See, to begin with a beginner's mind, to wipe the slate clean and start over. I call it's like zero-based budgeting. When we would go in to the yearly budget reviews, we would say, well, I got $1 million for my department last year. I need $1,200,000 this year. And the discussion would be, well, what do you need the extra $200,000 for? But periodically we went into discussions that were zero-based budgeting, and they said it was more like, why does your department even exist? Why should we give you anything? Why don't we take the corporation's money and give it to somebody else? What are you contributing to the bottom line of this corporation that warrants giving you any money at all? Okay? Totally different conversation. Instead of arguing about $200,000, now we're arguing about survival, very survival. But it was a good exercise because it helped everybody to get back down to the fundamentals of why their department existed. So there's times where we have to question everything back to the beginning. We have to just scrap all of the previous assumptions because they may no longer be valid. And we must come back and ask ourselves, am I sure? What do I know? Am I sure? How do I know it? And this then leads us to the question of, how do you know anything? How do you know anything? How do you know what you know? How do you know anything? And this question, are you sure, helps to lead us down that path. Right? 5 times, we were taught to ask 5 times in quality assurance. Why? 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 Now, as we first come into the world, as we are children and we are experiencing the world, a lot of the things, oh my God, I love the little ones. I can't remember, somewhere I read how many times a day a 4-year-old asks the question why. Asks the question why. I was in a grocery store many years ago. I'm sure I've told you this story before, but I was in a grocery store many years ago. I went in to get some things. And when you first go in the grocery store, you hit the produce section. They've got that laid out, but the milk and the bread are all the way at the other end of the store. They make you walk through the whole store to get it. So when I went in, there was this young mommy, and she had this little guy, and he was maybe 2.5 years old, and he was as cute as a button. And she sat him up in the back of that little seat in the back of the cart, and she was going through the produce section, and this little guy was 1,000,000 questions. What is this, Mommy? What is this? And she would say, well, that's an apple. And he would say, apple? And she would say, yes, you know what an apple is. We had an apple for breakfast this morning. And you could see the little light go off in his head. He'd go, oh, apple, yes. And then she'd move the wagon a little bit. What is this, Mommy? She said, well, that's an orange. And he would say, orange? And she'd say, yes, orange. You like oranges. And she would talk to him about the last time they had an orange. And she couldn't move that cart more than a foot. And this little guy had another question. And she was so loving and she was so patient with him. As she was going about getting everything on her list, she was teaching that little one all about supermarkets, all about food, all about life. But it's this curiosity, you see, it's this curiosity that the little ones have, that are constantly asking questions, constantly seeking, constantly wanting to know. Now, in the biography of Ernest Holmes, right, so today we're going back to the very first chapter of the introduction to the textbook. And over the course of January, we're going to be going back and forth through those first 4 chapters. But when Ernest Holmes was a little boy, he was very curious. His mother called him the big question mark because he was always asking questions, And I think of that little guy in the grocery store when I hear that. And he was very playful and he was very joyful, the little bit that we get from his brother Fenwick, who wrote a loving biography of him. But he was born in 1888 in Bethel, Maine, which was the backwoods at the time, lumbering and the lumber jacks and those kind of things there. And when he was little, they attended, I believe it was a congregational church. Fenwick went on to become a congregational minister before he got into science of mind and eventually into divine science. But Ernest's job as a little boy was to pump the pedals on the pipe organ. There was pedals there that had to be operated by the feet of the organist. And of course there were other pedals. If you ever seen one of those pipe organs, they had, they played with their hands, they pulled knobs, and they had pedals with their feet, and they did all kinds of things together to make music. But they had to build up a supply of air. by pumping by pumping the pedals to get the bellows going. Can you imagine learning how to do that, pumping and playing and pulling knobs and all of those kind of things? So what they did to relieve the organist of some of those duties was they got little boys, and the little boys would lay flat on their stomach underneath the organ, and they would push the pedals with their hands like this while the organist played. And that was a job that was assigned to Ernest at one time. And of course, there's a lot of downtime in that because the organ's not playing all the time. So what he would do is he would bring comic books with him. And he would lay there on his stomach on the, you can just picture this little guy laying there on the floor, you know, propped up on his elbows, reading his comic book, waiting for the cue it was time to start playing music, and then he would pump the pedals. So I give you this picture of a joyful, a playful, and a curious little boy who grew up to be a curious man, who gave us a teaching that is called the science of mind. And then there was an organization developed to carry that teaching forward that was called religious science. And it has evolved over the years, and now it is called Centers for Spiritual Living. One of the delightful things in the biography about Ernest Holmes is that it appears that he was raised in an environment where it was okay to ask questions. Didn't have to take anything just because he was told. So when we are little kids and we are growing up and we ask why this, why that, why the other thing, we are being given the opinions of the adults around us. When we were a little one, like the guy in the supermarket, it's our parents who are answering our questions. Later we get into school and it's our teacher, or we get into Sunday school and it's our clergy. But really what we are doing is we are being given information that they were given. And it's not necessarily true. It may have been true at one time, but is it still valid? Is it still true? And you and I, in the process of becoming adults, we have to examine those. We have to start asking ourselves, is that really true? Are you sure? How do you know? How do you know what you know? Critical thinking, how do you know what you know? And I suggest to you that if you put those little post-it notes all around with the words, "Are you sure?" followed by a question mark on it, and you start to ask yourself, whatever I was thinking about when I saw that note, are you sure? Are you sure? I think what you'll find out is, no, I'm not sure. I was told that. I read that in a book. I heard it in a Sunday talk. But I'm not really sure that I've ever done anything to verify that, to test it, to check it out, you see. And this was the attitude that Dr. Holmes brought to his work when he started to teach. Now, in 1898, I believe it was, William James, who was kind of called the father of American philosophy, William James, who was raised by parents who were at that time New Thought students, right? He went to Edinburgh. They would have a series of lectures, metaphysical lectures they would have at the university there every year. And William James was invited to speak, and he spoke on the varieties of religious experience. And you can buy that book. It's about 600 pages long. And you can buy that book, or you can get that book and you can read it. But in that book, James tossed out an idea. He said, no one has studied religion as a science. In other words, if scientists get together and they want to study electricity, they have a method, a procedure, a scientific method that they use. If they want to study psychology, even though it's much less tangible than electricity. There's certain conventions that they use, certain ways that they study, certain ways that they conduct experiments to try to prove their theories correctly, Pavlov's dogs, for example, those kind of things. And James said nobody has ever just kind of looked across religions and tried to study them as a scientist might. What do religions have in common, if anything? What do they have that are different, if anything? What methodology might there be to test their philosophy? And I believe Ernest Holmes took that as a challenge, if you will. And he said, yes, yes, we can do that. Now, one of the things that a scientist has to do is to drop preconceived notions, to drop biases, and to drop superstitions, I don't know if you remember this or not, but when Newton discovered that a prism would break light down into a rainbow, he was in a lot of trouble with the religious zealots at the time, because according to the biblical story of Noah and the ark, after the rain stopped, God put this rainbow in the sky. See? And that was taken as a sign that God would never again destroy the world by flood. Well, Newton came up with a physical explanation for the phenomena of a rainbow, a prism. And he was in trouble because suddenly that was in conflict with people's belief that no, a rainbow was a miracle. A rainbow was a miracle. Now we have to, as we go into exploring our concept of God, which is what we are doing, our concept of the divine, our concept of spirit, whatever we want to call it, we have to be willing to drop our superstitions as well, right? Remember when Galileo started to publish his works that said that it was the sun, not the earth, that was the center of the universe, or the galaxy. He was a heretic, right? Because the religious belief, or religious superstition, if you want to call it that, was that mankind was the pinnacle of God's creation and the center of everything. See, the sun rose for us and the sun set for us because we were the pinnacle of creation. And if that were not true, if the sun were the center of the galaxy, and the earth revolved around it, then it was at conflict with the religious teachings. But if we were to be a true scientist, if we are truly to explore ideas, what are religions? What are religious ideas? If we are truly interested in doing that, we have to be willing to scrape the building to the foundation, to take all of our old ideas and push them off to the side. And we have to be willing to say, are you sure? And if that is true, how would I know it was true? What am I willing to do? What kind of tests or experiments am I willing to make, as a scientist would make? I mean, this is what scientists do. They come up with a theory and then they say, well, how would we test that? How would we prove that? And then they try to come up with all of these different experiments that they can conduct. And if they have found something that is a principle, so to speak, something that is consistent in the universe, other people should be able to run those same tests and get the same results. Right? This is the scientific method. Now, of course, now as we are evolving in our consciousness, now we are starting to ask the question, but what influence does the experimenter have on the experiment? Do different people running the same experiment get different results based on their underlying beliefs of what those results should be? Okay? This is one of the 7 experiments that would change the world. A little booklet by that title. Right? What influence does the experimenter have on the experiment? And it's starting to find that, well, there are some differences. There are some differences. the material world is not as material as we think it is. But nevertheless, Dr. Holmes started to approach this subject of religion or philosophy, or whatever you wanted to call it. And he says, how would we start from the beginning? What are some of the fundamental ideas, and then how would we know if they were true? And out of this evolved the textbook, The Science of Mind. Out of this evolved the organization of religious science, which some people would get upset with that. Is, well, that's an oxymoron. It can be religion or it can be science, but it can't be both. And so eventually the name was changed to Centers for Spiritual Living. But what about your life, and what about my life? Are we willing to go to zero-based budgeting with our ideas about God, our ideas about life, our ideas about our own self, our ideas about how things work? Are we willing to have the Zen mind, the beginner's mind, and to start all over again? Now here's what's kind of an interesting point to me. This planet has revolved all the way around the sun in the last 364 and 1/4 days, whatever the actual duration of a year is. And from our viewpoint here on Earth, we look up and we say the Earth is in exactly the same position it was a year ago. That's why we say we completed a year. We're back to the beginning of the new year. Now, you could take any day of the year and make it a new year, and other cultures have their New Year's Day at different times, and some go by a lunar calendar instead of a solar calendar, and all these things. But the idea is pretty much the same. We're back where we started again, one more time. Once more again, once more again. But there's a difference, you see, there's a slight difference. Because in that year's time, the sun has also been moving. So even though the relationship between the earth and the sun may be where it was a year ago, the sun is not in the same spot. So we're not really exactly where we were a year ago. We're looking at things from a different viewpoint, or a different vantage point. And very, very slowly you get the precession of the axis, and we move, and the sun moves through the different astrological signs, right? Now we're in Aquarius. And I told you, remember, when Jesus was here, the beginning of Christianity was the sign of Pisces, which is the fish, and the fish became a symbol for Christianity. And at the end of his time on earth, Jesus told the disciples, go look for the sign of the man carrying the water at the age of Aquarius. So that's how all that got tied into astrological interpretations of the Bible. But the sun, if you look at where the sun is against the backdrop of the stars, that changes ever so slightly. Ever so slightly, the precession of the axis. We move into the signs, so to speak. We're not in the same spot we were a year ago. We're slightly different. But not only has the sun been moving within the galaxy has been moving within the universe. So now the entire galaxy is in a different position in the universe. I'm following with great interest this launch of this new space telescope. I can't wait for those images to come back, because when I look at the ones from Hubble, it's mind-boggling. It's just mind-boggling. So the sun has moved around the earth, the earth has moved around the sun. But the sun itself has moved within the galaxy, and the galaxy itself has moved within the universe, and the universe is expanding. And we have to say, the universe is expanding into what? Into what? What is beyond the universe that it can expand into? And it's, well, there's nothing beyond the universe. Well, how can it expand into nothing, you know? And all of these deeper questions, and you've got to say, are you sure? Are you sure? How do you know what you know? So Dr. Holmes invited his readers, invited his students to do away with superstition, to do away with presupposed notions, to take the things that parents told us and teachers told us and Sunday school teachers told us, and stop and ask ourselves, how do I know that that's true? How do I know that that's true? His first book he wrote in 1919, it was called Creative Mind and Success. He grew up in backwoods Maine, and he went to Boston. One of his siblings had a business there in Boston, and he went to work, and he discovered the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson and said, which Wendy gave us the quote today from Emerson. And Dr. Holmes said it was like taking a drink of cool water. He finally found somebody whose ideas kind of matched up with the way he was thinking. In the late 1800s, of course, we didn't have TVs or radios or the internet or any of those things. And the way that people entertained themselves and the way that they educated themselves was there was a series of lectures, the Chappaqua lectures. It actually started by the Methodist Church and then kind of spread out into beyond the Methodist Church. But they would arrange for different programs to come to a hall in the town, and there would be speakers, there would be entertainment, there would be all these different programs, and that's what people did. And of course, it was not unlike if you've gone to a seminar in a hotel today and you've got the speakers, and then they say, oh, and if you want more information, it's in my book, it's for sale on the table on the back there, So they would have back of the room sales, just like we do today. And Dr. Holmes's mother, who encouraged him to question, used to attend these, and she brought home a book. I'm going to send out a list this week to the email distribution with some books that are available on the internet. But one of them was called Natural Law in a Spiritual World by Henry Drummond. And it's available on Kindle for free if you go to Amazon. Natural Law in a Spiritual Universe. And that was one of the books that Fenwick mentions was in the home that Ernest grew up in. And Ernest pays homage to that in this first chapter of the textbook when he says the law of mind is a natural law in a spiritual world. So Ernest Holmes read Emerson. The man he worked for was married to a Christian Science practitioner, and Ernest went and studied with the Christian Science practitioner. Later, he went and studied with Emma Curtis Hopkins, who was very influential in the Christian Science movement, and then later went out and founded her own movement, a school of theology in Illinois. She was called a teacher of teachers. Ernest found the works of Thomas Troward, and they gave him this understanding that there is a law, that things operate according to a law. Right? There is order. There is a certain way in which things operate. It's done unto you according to your belief. And he also read a book by a Hindu mystic called The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo. Now I'm going to send these out in an email. You can find everything that I just mentioned there. You can find in PDF format on the internet. They're all written long ago and in public domain, or the organizations that promote those teachings have put them out there. And one more book I'll mention while we're at it is his brother Fenwick's book, Being and Becoming, which I believe is Fenwick's interpretation of The Life Divine by Sri Aurobindo, only is much shorter. The Life Divine is over 2,000 pages long, and Fenwick's book is only about 100. But Ernest moved to Venice, California. Fenwick had a church and was the pastor of a church in Venice, and Ernest moved there to get a job in the procurement department of Parks and Recreation. And the two of them went together and they started to give lectures on the teachings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. They were billed as Emersonian lecturers. And that's where he started. in the early 1900s, wrote his first book in 1919. The first version of the Science of Mind textbook was written in 1926, and that is also available in PDF format. But the one that we use today was written in 1936. So Ernest kind of assimilated all of these different ideas and went and asked us, how do you know what you know? What is your concept of this thing that we call God? Why? Are you sure? How would you know if what you believe is true? See, and then he took it further and said, if there is this power in the universe, this power that responds to us according to belief, which is what Jesus taught, if it's really there, how would you know unless you try it? See, your parents can tell you about it. I can tell you about it. Teachers can tell you about it. But unless you try it for yourself and find a way to make it work, even if it's there, if you can't make it work, it may well not exist for you. But if it is there and you learn how to cooperate with it, well, then it makes all the difference in the world to your life. So for today, I just hope that we can come together into a spirit of curiosity, that we are willing to take everything that we ever believed, ever knew, ever thought we knew, and be willing to put it up on the auction block, so to speak, for zero-based budgeting and say, I'm willing to let go of the ideas that no longer serve me. Or we are willing to look at ideas and see them from a slightly different viewpoint, because just as the sun and the galaxy have moved in the last year, and it may look very much the same as it did a year ago, it's not exactly the same. You and I are not exactly the same people we were a year ago. So over the course of January, we're going to continue these discussions centered around the first 4 chapters of the introduction to the 1936 Science of Mind textbook by Ernest Holmes. If you don't have one, I strongly suggest that you get one. We reference it all year long. Read those first 4 chapters. I'll send out an email with the other books that I mentioned. Follow along if you want. Get a copy of them to save, to read later. But be that sponge, be that little sponge like that guy in the supermarket, that little guy in the supermarket. What's this? What's that? Do we eat this? Do we know that? Have that passion, have that curiosity. The world we live in is so amazing, and we take it so much for granted. You know, we could not breathe if the trees did not give us their breath, and they could not breathe if we did not give ours back to them. Who made it that way? Why is it that way? Is it purely a chemical accident? Yeah. Look at that rock. Go out in the yard and pick up a rock and look at that rock and ask yourself, how did that rock come to life? How did that rock generate life? Did it? Well, that's the materialistic view of the world. The chemicals and the minerals and the water got together and somehow became alive, you know. So to me, that's almost like Frosty the Snowman. There must have been magic in that hat. How did that happen? How did that happen? Right? So the mystic will tell us life was already in that rock. Life was already in that rock, trying to escape, trying to push forward into a different form that had the ability to become aware, self-aware. And that's you and I. But the gift of self-awareness might as well not have been given if we will not use it. So for today, I ask you to consider, are you willing to become aware of what you believe? Are you willing to toss out any and all old beliefs that no longer serve you? Are you willing to revisit and tweak the beliefs that do serve you because you're in a different place now than you were a year ago. But most importantly, are you willing to explore this whole year? Willing to explore as an adventurer? Dr. Holmes called us spiritual adventurers in the unexplored territory of mind. Are you willing to get out your magnifying glass and follow the clues and see where the love of God will lead you this year? We'll pick it up next week with going back to the basics, the introduction to the science of mind. And so it is.